The Velvet Lounge shimmered under the flickering neon lights of Bourbon Street, a sanctuary of elegance carved out of New Orleans' wild heart. Inside, crystal glasses clinked against polished mahogany tables, their delicate chime weaving through the low hum of conversation and the distant wail of a trumpet spilling in from the night. Lila Jackson glided between the tables, her silver tray steady despite the chaos, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her starched black uniform. To the wealthy patrons sipping their cocktails, old money in tailored suits and debutantes dripping in pearls, she was a ghost, there to refill their drinks and vanish. But her eyes betrayed her, darting to the grand Steinway piano tucked in the corner, its ebony finish glowing like liquid midnight under the chandeliers. It sat silent, a prop for the rich to admire, never to play. Every time Lila passed it, a pang shot through her chest. She could still feel the warped keys of her grandmother's upright in that sagging Ninth Ward house, where she'd spent her childhood coaxing ragtime and blues from the stubborn old thing. Music had been her rebellion, her sanctuary, a promise that she could be more than the world expected. But dreams didn't pay the rent or put food on the table when her mom got sick. Now trapped in the rhythm of serving and smiling, she wondered if that promise had expired. The night wore on, the dinner rush fading into a softer cadence of lingering chatter and the clink of champagne flutes. Lila wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her practiced smile holding firm as she cleared a table littered with half-eaten oysters and crumpled napkins. The piano loomed in her peripheral vision, its silence louder than the room's buzz, a taunting reminder of what she'd buried. She'd once dreamed of Juilliard, of stages bathed in spotlight, but those fantasies had drowned in the floodwaters of reality. A mother's hospital bills, a landlord's threats, a life that didn't wait for talent to bloom. Still, the Steinway whispered to her, daring her to remember who she'd been before the apron and the tray. Then, the air shifted. A ripple of tension spread through the staff, a hushed exchange of glances that made Lila's spine stiffen. She turned just as the heavy oak doors swung open, revealing Vincent Moreau. He strode in like he owned the place, tall, broad-shouldered, his tailored suit screaming wealth and power. The room seemed to bend around him, conversations faltering as his entourage trailed behind, their laughter sharp and performative. Lila caught his gaze for a split second, cold, piercing, amused, and her stomach twisted. She'd served men like him before, the kind who thrived on making others small. Tonight, though, something in his smirk told her she wouldn't slip by unnoticed. The stage was set, and she didn't even know it yet. The Velvet Lounge settled into a quieter rhythm as the dinner crowd thinned, leaving behind a haze of cigarette smoke and the clink of dessert spoons against porcelain. Lila Jackson adjusted her apron, her hands still trembling from the weight of Vincent Moreau's arrival. He sat at the center table, a king holding court, his broad frame dominating the space as his entourage laughed too loudly at his every word. She'd hoped to avoid him. Men like Vincent, with their tailored suits and predatory smiles, always meant trouble. But as she approached with a bottle of their finest rye, his eyes locked onto her, sharp and unyielding, like a hawk spotting prey. "Lila, is it?" he drawled, his voice smooth as velvet but edged with something cruel. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. He leaned back, swirling his drink, his smirk widening. "Tell me, Lila, what's a girl like you doing in a place like this? Wasting away with a tray when you could be something more?" The question dripped with mockery, a baited hook dangled before his cronies, who snickered on cue. Lila forced a tight smile. "Just working, sir, making sure you're taken care of." Vincent's eyes gleamed, catching a flicker of defiance in her tone. "Oh, I bet you've got dreams," he pressed, his voice rising to draw the room's attention. "What are they, huh? Don't tell me you're just another nobody with nothing to show?" Lila's fingers tightened around the bottle, the cool glass grounding her as Vincent's words hung in the air like a dare. She could feel the weight of every eye in the Velvet Lounge shifting toward her, the hum of chatter dimming as if the room itself held its breath. "I play piano," she said finally, her voice steady despite the heat creeping up her neck. She'd meant to end it there, to let the conversation die, but Vincent's face lit up with a twisted delight. A pianist, he exclaimed, clapping his hands once, the sound sharp like a gunshot. How quaint. Let's hear it then. Samrisardia rum. He gestured grandly toward the Steinway, his grin daring her to refuse. His entourage erupted in laughter, a chorus of hyenas feeding off her discomfort. Lila's stomach twisted. She glanced at Clara, her best friend, who stood frozen near the bar, eyes wide with a mix of fear and encouragement. Oh, I couldn't, Lila started. I'm working. But Vincent cut her off, his voice booming now. Nonsense. A talent like that shouldn't hide behind a tray, unless, of course, you're all talk. The room tilted, the air thick with expectation. He leaned forward, his smirk ablade. Go on, sweetheart. Play, or admit you're just another dreamer who'll never amount to anything. The challenge landed like a slap, and Lila felt something snap inside her. A spark of rage, of pride, of a girl who'd once believed she could conquer the world with a song. The velvet lounge held its breath as Vincent Moreau's taunt echoed off the walls. His words a lit match tossed into the dry tinder of Lila Jackson's resolve. She stood rooted to the spot, the bottle of rye still clutched in her hands, its weight suddenly unbearable. Every pair of eyes bore into her, some curious, some mocking, all waiting for her to crumble. Vincent leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk daring her to prove him wrong. Well, he pressed, voice dripping with condescension, don't keep us waiting, sweetheart. The laughter from his table stabbed at her, but it was the silence from the rest of the room that cut deeper, a vacuum of expectation she couldn't escape. Lila's gaze darted to Clara, who stood by the bar, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes screaming, You can do this. Then to the Steinway, its polished keys glinting like a lifeline in the dim light. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the whispers around her. She could walk away, let Vincent have his cheap victory, and fade back into the shadows of the lounge. Or she could fight, not for him, but for the girl who'd once poured her soul into every note, who'd sworn she'd never let the world break her. Slowly, deliberately, she set the bottle down on his table, the clink of glass on wood ringing like a declaration. With a breath that felt like fire, she turned and took her first step toward the piano. The hardwood floor creaked beneath Lila's shoes as she crossed the velvet lounge, each step a rebellion against the years she'd spent bearing her dreams. The Steinway loomed larger with every stride, its silent presence a mirror to the storm raging inside her. She could feel Vincent's stare drilling into her back, his amusement a palpable weight, but it was drowned out by the memory of her grandmother's voice. Play, Lila. Play like the world's listening. The room blurred. Patrons, chandeliers, the flicker of neon through the windows. Until it was just her and the piano. She slid onto the bench, the cool leather a shock against her skin, and let her trembling fingers hover over the keys. A cough broke the silence, then a snicker from Vincent's table. $5 says she freezes, one of his cronies muttered, loud enough to sting. Lila's jaw tightened. She glanced at Hank, the grizzled chef, leaning against the kitchen door. His nod was subtle, but his eyes held a flicker of something, recognition, maybe faith, that steadied her. This wasn't about Vincent or his money or the room's judgment. It was about the music she'd locked away, the piece of herself she'd almost lost. Her hands settled on the keys, the familiar weight grounding her like an anchor in a hurricane. She exhaled long and slow, and in that moment, the fear melted into resolve. The first note was hers to claim, and she wouldn't let it slip away. The first note trembled from the Steinway, a fragile whisper that cut through the velvet lounge like a blade through silk. Lila Jackson's fingers hesitated, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her. But then the music took over. She closed her eyes, letting the familiar pull of the keys drag her back to the ninth ward, to the nights she'd played until her hands ached and the stars faded. What started as a soft, tentative, moonlight sonata twisted into something raw, a jazz improvisation born from New Orleans soul, wild and untamed, with syncopated rhythms that danced like bourbon spilling over ice. The notes swelled, fierce and haunting, each one a piece of her she'd hidden too long. The room shifted around her, though she barely noticed. A fork clattered to the floor, abandoned mid-bite. A woman in a sequined dress gasped, her hand clutching her pearls as the melody wrapped around her like smoke. Lila's hands flew faster, the Steinway singing under her touch, his voice a roar that drowned out the memory of Vincent's smirk. She wasn't playing for him. Not anymore. This was for the girl who'd once believed she could bend the world with a song, who'd lost herself in the grind of survival. The music built to a crescendo, a storm of sound that shook the chandeliers, and for the first time in years, Lila felt alive, unburdened, free. Hank stood motionless at the kitchen door, his weathered face softening as the melody hit him like a freight train. He knew this song, not the notes but the spirit, echoes of a teenage Lila pounding out the same fire at a long-forgotten talent show. Back then, she'd been unstoppable, a spark the world couldn't snuff out. Now that spark flared again, and the velvet lounge bent to its will. A man at a nearby table set his drink down, untouched, his jaw slack as the music painted pictures of moonlit bayous and heartbreak. Even Clara, wiping down the bar, froze, her rag dangling as tears welled in her eyes. Not from sadness, but pride. Lila didn't see them. She was lost in the flood of her own creation, the Steinway a willing accomplice, as she poured years of silence into every chord. The final arpeggio rose, sharp and defiant, then softened into a whisper that lingered like the last breath of a storm. She let it hang there, her hands still on the keys, her chest heaving. The silence that followed was deafening, a void where the world held its breath. She opened her eyes, blinking against the glare of the chandeliers, and reality crashed back. The faces, the stares, the weight of what she'd just done. Vincent's table was quiet, his smirk nowhere to be found. Whatever came next, she'd already won something he couldn't touch. The last note faded into the velvet lounge, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against Lila Jackson's skin. She sat at the Steinway, her hands trembling on the keys, her breath ragged as the weight of her performance settled over her, like a second pulse. The room was a frozen tableau, patrons mid-sip, waiters with trays dangling, every face turned toward her in a stunned hush. A woman in a velvet hat dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her mascara streaking as the melody's echo lingered in her chest. A young man near the bar, who'd been glued to his phone all night, let it slip to the table, his eyes wide with something like wonder. Even the air felt different, charged with the raw energy Lila had unleashed. She dared a glance at Vincent Moreau's table, expecting his smirk, his mockery, but it was gone. He sat rigid, fingers locked around his glass, his face a mask of something unreadable. Discomfort, maybe, or the flicker of awe he couldn't hide. His cronies shifted uneasily, their earlier laughter swallowed by the void she'd created. Lila's chest tightened, not with fear but with a strange, electric triumph. She'd stripped away his game, turned his stage into hers, and the room knew it. Clara caught her eye from across the bar, her grin fierce and unapologetic. A silent, "I told you so" that made Lila's throat burn with emotion. Hank leaned against the kitchen door, arms crossed, his grizzled face softening as he watched Lila. He'd seen this before, years ago when she'd lit up a dingy community hall with that same fire, a kid too big for the world she'd been born into. Now that kid was back, and the velvet lounge was her witness. A businessman in a three-piece suit set his fork down, his plate of crawfish forgotten, his eyes locked on Lila as if she'd rewritten the rules of the night. A couple near the window, mid-argument, fell silent, their hands inching closer across the table, pulled together by the music's spell. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, a tide that swept through the room and left no one untouched. Lila exhaled, her fingers still resting on the keys, the Steinway warm beneath her touch. She felt exposed, raw, like she'd spilled every secret she'd ever kept onto the floor. Vincent's silence gnawed at her, his usual arrogance replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than any insult. His gaze met hers for a fleeting second, and she saw it, a crack in his armor, a man who'd built his empire on control now grappling with something he couldn't buy. The room teetered on the edge, the silence stretching taut, ready to snap. Then from somewhere in the back, a single clap broke through, a spark that promised to ignite everything she dared to set free. The single clap from the back of the velvet lounge shattered the silence like a stone through glass, and then the dam broke. Applause erupted, a thunderous wave that rolled over Lila Jackson as she sat at the Steinway, her hands still trembling on the keys. It wasn't polite or restrained. It was raw, fervent, a roar of admiration that shook the chandeliers and rattled the walls. Patrons leapt to their feet, some clapping so hard their palms turned red, others shouting, "Bravo!" over the din. A woman in a green dress stood on her chair, tears streaming down her face as she cheered, while an older man near the bar pounded his fist on the counter, hollering, "That's what I'm talking about." The room was alive, electric, and Lila was its beating heart. She blinked against the onslaught, her chest tight with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Clara bolted from the bar, weaving through the crowd to throw her arms around Lila, her voice cracking as she whispered, "You did it, girl! You freaking did it!" Lila hugged her back, the warmth of her friend grounding her as the noise swelled. She'd turned Vincent's cruel game into something unstoppable, a moment no one could take away. Her eyes flicked to Hank, still by the kitchen, his grizzled face split by a rare grin. He nodded once, sharp and proud, as if to say she'd finally claimed what was hers. The applause thundered on, a tidal wave that lifted Lila higher than she'd ever been, but her gaze drifted to Vincent Moreau's table, searching for the crack in his facade. He sat motionless, his hands clasped tight around his glass. The smugness that had defined him earlier wiped clean. His entourage fidgeted, their earlier jeers replaced by awkward coughs and sidelong glances. Vincent's jaw twitched, his eyes fixed on Lila. Not with mockery now, but with something heavier, something he couldn't name. She'd stripped him bare, turned his spotlight into her own, and the room's adoration was a mirror to his defeat. For a man who thrived on control, this was a wound he hadn't seen coming. Lila rose from the bench, her legs shaky but her spine straight, feeling taller than the shadows she'd lived in for years. The crowd parted as she stepped forward, their whispers of "incredible" and "who is she?" trailing her like a wake. She didn't need their praise to know what she'd done. She'd felt it in the keys, in the way the music had poured out of her like blood from a reopened scar. But Vincent's silence gnawed at her, a loose thread in her triumph. She'd won the night, but the game wasn't over. As she moved back toward the dining floor, his table loomed ahead, a quiet challenge in the chaos. Whatever he said next, she was ready, not as a waitress, but as the woman who'd just rewritten the rules. The applause faded into a low hum as Lila Jackson crossed the velvet lounge, the air still crackling with the aftershock of her performance. She moved with a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed, her apron feeling lighter, her steps surer. Patrons reached out as she passed, their voices soft with awe. "That was unreal. Don't stop playing, ever." But her focus narrowed to Vincent Moreau's table. He sat there like a statue, his broad shoulders tense, his glass of rye untouched since she'd left the piano. The crowd's adoration had flipped the script, and the man who tried to break her now looked like he'd been caught in his own trap. She stopped beside him, reaching for the empty plates scattered across his table, her hands steady despite the storm still churning inside her. Vincent cleared his throat, the sound rough, forced, and she met his gaze, unflinching, unafraid. "Well," he said, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier bite, "I'll give you this. I didn't see that coming." It wasn't an apology, but it was close, a crack in the armor of a man who rarely bent. Lila tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That much is clear," she replied, her tone even, sharp enough to sting. A nervous chuckle rippled through his entourage, but Vincent didn't flinch. He studied her, his eyes narrowing as if seeing her for the first time, a puzzle he couldn't solve. Vincent took a slow sip of his rye, the ice clinking against the glass as he set it down with deliberate care. "You've made your point," he said, his voice a grudging concession, though a shadow of his old smirk flickered beneath it. "No need to rub it in." Lila's smile sharpened, a quiet fire in her eyes. "It was never about you," she said simply, stacking the plates with a grace that belied the weight of the moment. I just wanted to play. The words landed like a soft blow, and for once, Vincent had no retort. His companions shifted uncomfortably, their usual bravado muted, as if they sensed the shift in power. A waitress had turned their game upside down. Lila turned to walk away, her head high, the echo of the Steinway still thrumming in her veins. She felt the room's eyes linger, not with pity or judgment now, but with a respect she'd never known here. Clara caught her arm near the bar, squeezing it with a grin that said everything words couldn't. Hank watched from the kitchen, his nod a silent salute to the kid he'd always believed in. But as Lila reached for her tray, a voice cut through the buzz. One of Vincent's cronies, low and stunned. "I got it on video, man. It's blowing up online already." Her heart skipped, a jolt of panic mixing with pride. The night wasn't over, and the world beyond the lounge was about to crash in. The velvet lounge buzzed with a new energy as Lila Jackson slipped back into the rhythm of her shift, the clatter of plates and glasses a strange counterpoint to the adrenaline still coursing through her. The echo of her performance lingered in the air, in the glances of patrons who now saw her. Not a waitress, but a force. She wiped down a table, her hands steady despite the whirlwind in her chest, when a shadow fell across the wood. She looked up to find a man standing there. Late 50s, silver hair neatly combed, his suit understated but sharp. His eyes held a quiet intensity, like he'd seen 1,000 stages and knew a star when he spotted one. "That was something else," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I'm Miles Carter." Lila froze, the name ringing a bell she couldn't place. "Thank you," she managed, her throat tight. He smiled faintly, pulling a business card from his pocket and sliding it across the table. "I'm a music producer. Been in town for a gig, but I didn't expect to stumble into this." Her breath hitched. A producer? And the card felt like a live wire in her fingers. "You've got real talent," Miles continued. "The kind that doesn't belong behind a tray." She glanced at Clara, who'd overheard and was practically vibrating with excitement, then back at Miles. The world tilted, possibility crashing into years of doubt, and she didn't know whether to run or leap. Before Lila could respond, Vincent Moreau's voice sliced through the moment, sharp and unwelcome. He'd risen from his table, brushing past his still-dazed cronies to loom nearby, his presence a storm cloud over Miles' offer. "She's not the real deal," he said, his tone dismissive but strained, like he was trying to claw back control. "Just a fluke. One lucky night." Miles turned, unfazed, his gaze cool as he sized Vincent up. "Funny," he replied. "I've built a career spotting talent, and I'd say she's got more in her than you'll ever understand." Vincent's jaw tightened, but he didn't push, maybe because the room's shift was still too raw, too real. Lila's pulse raced, caught between Vincent's venom and Miles' lifeline. She clutched the card tighter, its edges biting into her palm. "Have you ever thought about recording?" Miles asked, ignoring Vincent entirely. "I'd love to hear more." Her mind spun. Recording? A studio? The dreams she'd buried under late shifts and rent payments surged back, vivid and terrifying. I don't know," she stammered, but Miles just nodded, patient. "Think it over. You've got my number." He tipped his head and walked off, leaving her reeling. Vincent snorted, retreating to his table, but his words lingered like a ghost. Clara grabbed her arm, whispering, "This is it, Lila." Yet as she stared at the card, a shadow of her past crept in. Something Hank knew, something she'd tried to forget. The Velvet Lounge had quieted, the last of the night's patrons trickling out into the humid New Orleans air. But Lila Jackson lingered near the bar, Miles Carter's card burning a hole in her pocket. The weight of his offer pressed against her ribs, a dream she'd long buried now clawing its way back. She was wiping down the counter, lost in thought, when Hank's heavy footsteps broke her reverie. The old chef shuffled over, his apron stained with gumbo and grease, his eyes carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. "We need to talk," he said, his voice gruff but soft, like he'd been holding something in too long. He pulled her into the cramped kitchen, the clatter of the dining room fading behind them. "I saw you play tonight," Hank started, leaning against a steel counter. Same fire I saw years ago, back at that talent show in '09. You were what, 16? Took first place. Had folks on their feet. Lila's breath caught, memories flooding back. Her in a borrowed dress, the rickety stage, the applause that felt like the world opening up. I never forgot it, he went on, his gaze steady. You were a damn prodigy, Lila. Then you just stopped. She looked away, the sting of her mother's illness, the hospital bills, the choices she'd had to make all rushing in. Hank's voice dropped lower. Why'd you quit, kid? What happened? Lila's throat tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as Hank's question hung in the air. Mom got sick, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Cancer. I had to take care of her. Hospital runs, bills piling up. Piano didn't pay for chemo. The words spilled out, jagged and raw, a confession she'd never spoken aloud. Hank's face softened, the lines around his eyes deepening with something like sorrow. I tried to keep going, she continued, but every time I sat at the keys, all I heard was her coughing, the machines beeping. I couldn't. She stopped, swallowing hard, the guilt of abandoning her gift twisting like a knife. Hank nodded, slow and heavy, like he'd pieced together a puzzle he'd been holding for years. You didn't quit, Lila. Life took it from you. But tonight, that was you taking it back. He tapped a finger on the counter, his voice firming. I've seen a lot of folks give up, but you've still got it. Don't let it slip again. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, but from the truth in his words, the weight of a past she'd tried to bury. She pulled Miles' card from her pocket, staring at it as Hank's gaze followed. That video's out there now, he added, a hint of urgency creeping in. Folks are talking. What you gonna do about it? The question landed like a crossroads, and Lila knew the answer would change everything. The Velvet Lounge was nearly empty now, the neon glow dimming as the night wound down, but Lila Jackson couldn't shake the storm brewing inside her. Hank's words echoed in her skull. You've still got it, mingling with the memory of Miles Carter's card, now a crumpled lifeline in her apron pocket. She stood behind the bar, polishing glasses she'd already cleaned, her mind a tug-of-war between the safe grind of waitressing and the wild, terrifying pull of the piano. Clara slid onto a stool, her eyes bright with a mix of hope and impatience. You're not seriously thinking of ignoring this, right? She said, tapping the counter. That video's got thousands of views already. People are losing their minds over you. Lila's stomach churned. She'd peeked at her phone earlier. Clips of her playing, shaky footage from Vincent's crony, spreading like wildfire online. Comments poured in. Who is she? She's a genius. But with every like, the pressure tightened around her chest. What if it was a fluke? What if she couldn't do it again? Then her phone buzzed, a voicemail from Vincent Moreau himself. His voice was clipped, transactional. I'll fund your little music thing, but you'd work for me. Think about it. It wasn't an offer. It was a leash, a way to keep her under his thumb. Clara scoffed when Lila told her, he's scared of you now. Don't let him win. Lila set the glass down, her hands trembling as Clara's words sank in. Vincent's offer was a trap. She knew it, but the idea of stepping back into the shadows of the Velvet Lounge felt like surrender. She pulled Miles' card from her pocket, running her thumb over the embossed letters. Recording, performing, a real shot at the life she'd dreamed of. It was right there, but it came with a cost, leaving the safety of the known, risking failure on a stage bigger than she'd ever imagined. What if I'm not good enough, she whispered, more to herself than Clara. Her friend leaned forward, fierce. You're scared, sure, but you're not a coward. That piano tonight, that was you, Lila. Don't let fear steal it again. The weight of Hank's revelation pressed in. Her prodigy days, the talent she'd let slip through her fingers. She thought of her mom, the nights she'd traded music for medicine, and how she'd never once heard regret in her mother's voice. Live, baby, she'd said near the end. Don't just survive. Lila's eyes stung, but her resolve hardened. She grabbed her phone, ignoring Vincent's voicemail, and dialed Miles Carter instead. It rang twice before his steady voice answered. Miles, it's Lila Jackson, she said, her voice firm despite the quake in her chest. I'm in. Clara's grin split wide, and as Lila hung up, She felt the first real breath of a future she'd finally chosen to chase. The French Quarter buzzed with late afternoon life as Lila Jackson stepped out of the velvet lounge. The weight of her apron swapped for a nervous energy that crackled through her veins. She'd called Miles Carter that morning, and now she stood outside a small recording studio on St. Anne Street, its faded brick facade humming with possibility. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a cramped room lined with soundproof foam and a piano that looked like it had seen 1,000 songs. Miles greeted her with a nod, his silver hair catching the dim light. "Glad you made it," he said, gesturing to the stool. "Let's hear what you've got." Lila sat, her fingers brushing the keys, the familiar weight steadying her racing heart. She started with a piece she'd written years ago, a bluesy riff laced with New Orleans soul, slow at first, then building into a cascade of notes that filled the tiny space. Miles leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp, taking in every chord. She played like she had at the lounge, raw and unfiltered. But this time it wasn't for survival. It was a beginning. When the last note faded, she looked up, breathless, waiting for judgment. Miles smiled, small but genuine. "That's a start," he said. "You've got a voice in those hands. Ever think about where it could take you?" Lila's breath hitched at Miles' question, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never dared to voice. "I used to," she admitted, her voice soft but steady, "before life got in the way." Miles chuckled, a warm sound that eased the tension in her shoulders. "Life's good at that," he said, pulling up a chair. "I once found a kid playing guitar on a street corner in Memphis. Nobody had ever heard of him. Took a chance, and he's selling out arenas now. Point is, talent like yours doesn't come around every day. You've got a shot, Lila." His words landed like a spark, igniting something she'd thought was long dead. She ran her fingers over the keys again, testing a new melody, bolder, freer, like the city outside the studio walls. Miles tapped his foot, nodding along, then stopped her mid-phrase. "Hold that," he said, scribbling something on a notepad. "We'll build on it. I've got a spot at Preservation Hall in 6 months. Small gig, but it's a start. You in?" Lila's heart leapt, the name of the iconic jazz venue echoing in her ears. 6 months to prove herself, to turn a fluke into a future. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm, a promise to herself as much as to him. As she left the studio, the New Orleans dusk wrapping around her, she felt lighter, like the girl who'd once played for the stars was finally stepping into the spotlight. 6 months had blurred past, and now Lila Jackson stood backstage at Preservation Hall, the thrum of the crowd seeping through the walls of the legendary New Orleans jazz haunt. The air smelled of old wood and anticipation, the stage lights casting long shadows as she clutched the edge of her dress, a simple black number Clara had insisted she wear. Miles Carter had kept his word, turning her raw talent into something polished, her late-night sessions in that cramped studio, now a song ready to meet the world. She peeked through the curtain, a sea of faces, some familiar. Clara beaming in the front row, Hank's grizzled figure beside her. Others strangers drawn by the viral spark of that velvet lounge night. Her fingers twitched, the memory of the Steinway still alive in them. But this was different. This wasn't a fluke or a dare. It was her, all of her, laid bare under the spotlight. The house lights dimmed and Miles' voice rumbled through the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lila Jackson." The crowd roared as she stepped out, the piano gleaming like a beacon. She sat, took a breath, and let her hands fall. The first notes of her original piece, a fusion of blues and jazz, born from the Ninth Ward and refined by sleepless nights, filled the room, bold and unapologetic. The audience leaned in, captivated, and for a moment, she was that kid again, playing like the stars were hers to claim. The melody soared, Lila's hands dancing across the keys with a confidence she'd fought to reclaim. Preservation Hall pulsed with her sound, every note a defiance of the years she'd spent invisible, every chord a tribute to her mother's quiet strength. The crowd swayed, some on their feet, others lost in the music's pull. Clara clapped wildly, tears streaking her face while Hank's gruff cheer cut through the din. Then in the dim back row, she saw him, Vincent Moreau, alone, his tailored suit stark against the worn seats. He wasn't smirking now. His hands came together, slow but deliberate, a clap that carried weight. As the final note rang out, the hall erupted, a standing ovation that shook the rafters. Lila stood, her chest heaving, and Vincent approached, a bouquet of white roses in hand. He handed them over, his voice low. "I was wrong," he said, the words rough but real. "You're the real deal. Congratulations." It wasn't just an apology, it was surrender. A man who'd built walls of pride now stepping through their ruins. She nodded, accepting the flowers, the past dissolving in the gesture. The spotlight held her, the crowd's roar a hymn to her journey, from a waitress cornered by doubt to a woman who'd rewritten her story. Outside, New Orleans hummed on, but for Lila the stars aligned at last. She'd played her truth, and the world had listened. This wasn't an end. It was her beginning.